Thank you for joining us today for our second program of the virtual Three Rivers Venture Fair. We are continuing the fair with session number 2, marijuana, CBD, and hemp, highs and lows, fits and starts. Before we begin, I would like to thank all of the Three Rivers Venture Fair sponsors. We would not be here without their generosity, and we are very grateful for their support. Their logos will continue to be shown throughout the various programs of the Venture Fair. Now, moving on to today's event. Our program features 4 experts in the cannabis industry who will discuss the regulatory changes needed to shore up industry segments before they go up in smoke. Our speakers today are Jennifer Minter, shareholder of Buchanan Ingersoll and Rooney; Liz Westbrook, Senior Advisor, Government Relations at Buchanan Ingersoll and Rooney; William Garvin, shareholder of Buchanan Ingersoll and Rooney; and Jason Rona, shareholder of Buchanan Ingersoll and Rooney, as well as today's moderator. If you have any questions for our panel during this event, please use the Q&A function and the panel will respond to as many as possible. I will now turn the program over to Jason.
Okay, thanks, Ian, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We really appreciate it. Hopefully, we'll make this an exciting and interesting conversation, and really do encourage you to participate going forward by using the question and answer box. So again, my name is Jason Rona. I'm a shareholder here at Buchanan and the co-founder of our cannabis group. We launched the cannabis group about 7 years ago as it was just starting to become a buzzword on CNBC, and we've had great success since then. And I'm happy to have some of my colleagues with me today to discuss their insights on the industry. So just at a high level, the cannabis market continues to mature with the big fish kind of gobbling the smaller fish up. Cash continues to be king as traditional financing sources remain unavailable. The hope here today is you can walk away with some ideas of where you may be able to place, some of the cash that you have on hand. I've been assured by Kelly that there's a lot of it here joining us virtually. We'll prognosticate on what the future holds for the industry on both the legal and the business side. And for those of you that joined us in February for our panel conversation with some of the same panelists, you'll hear the same kind of themes, but they are through the lens now of COVID and with the election coming up. We speculated then, there may be still some speculating going on today, but we have a little more insight as to where things are going to go. At this point, I'd like to invite my colleagues from Buchanan to introduce themselves, and we'll start with Jen, move to Liz, and then Will.
Sure. Thanks, Jason. And thanks, everyone, for joining us today. I'm Jen Minter. I am a shareholder of Buchanan Ingersoll and Rooney and chair of our corporate practice. I've been working in the cannabis space since Pennsylvania began its process of legalizing medical marijuana use, and have worked with clients since then, primarily in the dispensary and processing and cultivation space, with corporate formation, equity and other financings, and M&A transactions since then. Liz?
Hey everybody, I'm Liz Westbrook. I'm coming to you from DC. I am technically an attorney, and I like to keep that street cred by working for a law firm, but I do work in Buchanan's federal government relations practice. I focus on a number of healthcare issues. Got involved in the cannabis space when we had some of, actually Will talk about some of our FDA clients who needed some help navigating Congress and the federal issues around cannabis, CBD, medical, and adult use. So that got involved in that a few years ago. Buchanan has kind of really jumped in with both feet into the cannabis space, so it's been a lot of fun to work on. But I also work on health IT issues, women's health, and a whole host of other healthcare policy issues.
All right. And I'm Will Garvin, and I'm co-head of the cannabis practice here at Buchanan with Jason. I am also a shareholder in the FDA group. Been interested in the cannabis space since pretty much the Colorado legalized recreational marijuana, and we saw that there's going to be this confrontation between FDA and what was going on in the cannabis market. I'm also a member of the American Herbal Products Association's Cannabis Committee, also a member of Fidley's Cannabis Committee, and have been working in this space and helping clients deal with sort of all the issues dealing with the Food and Drug Administration, DEA, and cannabis for several years now. So turn it back to Jason.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Really appreciate that. And I think it'd be helpful to first level set everyone that is joining us virtually by turning to Jen and asking her to kind of discuss the state of legalization in the United States, what may be on the ballot here coming up, and maybe specifically what's going on in Pennsylvania from a legalization perspective.
Sure. Thanks, Jason. Happy to provide a quick overview to the group. So at this point in time in the US, we have approximately 33 states that allow for some form of medical marijuana use and procurement. In addition to that, there are 11 states plus DC that also allow for adult use of marijuana. So that's where things stand. Coming up next week, there are 4 states that have referendums relating to adult use on the ballot, and those are Arizona, Montana, New Jersey, which is important, and South Dakota. In addition, there are 2 states that have medical marijuana use on the ballots, and that is Mississippi and South Dakota. So clearly, we're well over a majority of states at this point that have some level of marijuana acceptance in the state. And that could be increasing as of next week. With respect to Pennsylvania, as folks know, we currently have medical marijuana use through our Department of Health. Interestingly, in September, Governor Wolf and Lieutenant Governor Fetterman came out and kind of made a public push, if you will, and called for the General Assembly to take up the issue of legalizing marijuana for recreational use. Their press release and their speeches kind of pointed to restorative justice issues, which, as we all know, is a very salient area at this point in time, and also revenue generation. A lot of states are struggling right now from a budgetary perspective as a result of COVID and otherwise. And so those are 2 areas that are very top of mind in a lot of folks' perspective at this point. And so it made sense to them to kind of come forward and urge the legislature to work with the executive branch to develop an adult use bill. As to whether that's going to happen, I've talked to our folks in Harrisburg, and their view is that the current makeup of the Pennsylvania legislature will not allow this issue to readily move forward. But as we all know, with the election coming up next week, not sure if that's going to change. I do think that if New Jersey approves adult use next week, that could be a pretty large factor that Pennsylvania will continue to look at in evaluating whether it makes sense to deploy that strategy in Pennsylvania.
Great. Thanks, Jen. Also, as kind of something to set a baseline here, Will, folks think about, I think those that are not immersed in the industry of, buying marijuana is, their kids are going out and talking about Purple Urkel and Gorilla Glue and Snoop's Kush and all these strange strains of marijuana, but it's really a diverse industry. And I was hoping you could help us understand what other sort of products are out there that kind of populate the industry and that folks can evaluate as potential investments.
Sure. So when I like to think about the cannabis industry, I like to think about sort of 4 distinct classes of products, and they all fall within a different sort of regulatory regime, and they all have their own different sort of risks and benefits. So the first is the medical marijuana. And as Jen mentioned, we got 33 states right now that have medical marijuana. That first came out of California back in 1996. And since then it's spread across the United States. And those are regulated at the state level. They're highly regulated. There's license, and every sort of state has their own deal with medical marijuana. And investment may be somewhat limited in that space. Second is recreational marijuana. Again, that is a very state-focused thing that started off with Colorado passing a referendum in November 2012 that legalized recreational marijuana in the state, and that has now spread to 11 states, and there's more looking at it coming forward. And again, that market looks to be like it could be a little bit bigger because obviously it's not just people with prescriptions, it's people who could consume it, any adult who can consume it who they wanted to. But sometimes investment is limited to people within the state. And again, it's a very state-centric focused investment because it's, again, just limited to the state. Then you move to the third category, and that is pharmaceuticals developed with cannabis. The most notable example is GW's Epidiolex, which recently got approved and is now Schedule 5 for treatment of Dravet syndrome. There were previous approvals of THC products, Sesamet and Marinol. Those were synthetic THCs. So this is the first product where you've actually had a botanical extract of marijuana. And you've seen a lot of interest in the investor community pouring money into stocks that are investing in pharmaceuticals in the cannabis space, because this was a space previously where it was really hard to do a lot of research and where there isn't a lot known. So there's a belief that knowing more about the cannabinoid system will generate a lot of results in the pharmaceutical space. And then the last space, which has really grown up since the passage of the Farm Bill in 2018, is this consumer product space. And what happened was they redefined the definition between hemp and marijuana. And as a result, everything that fell within hemp is now allowed to be utilized, or it doesn't have the problems of being a controlled substance. And so those things could be arguably in consumer products. And that's why you see this big growth in CBD and food and dietary supplements and even in cosmetics. So those are the sort of four categories I think about when I think about investing in the cannabis space.
Great. And Will, can you touch on, everyone I think by now has heard of CBD. Can you touch on what exactly that is and whether that is in fact legal, just to be crystal clear around it?
Sure. So CBD cannabidiol is a well-known substance. It got a lot of press early on because of Charlotte's Web and its amazing powers to help these kids with seizure disorders. You saw these parents traveling out to Colorado so they could give their kids this medicine. And then there was just a big drive for people to take CBD for a variety of elements, including, sleep disorders or stress. Now, CBD's legality is interesting because it somewhat depends upon where the product is derived. So if it's derived from marijuana, then it would be a scheduled product. And the only marijuana-derived CBD that's allowed on the market right now is GW Labs' Epidiolex, which is a Schedule 5 controlled substance, which is the lowest in the schedule. But because they redefined this definition between hemp and marijuana, they were allowed to, previously it was hard to get CBD from the parts of the plant that were considered to be part of the marijuana plant. Those would be the leaves and the flowers. But because the Farm Bill redefined where that line was and said anybody essentially under 0.3% THC in the plant or in the extracts, those can be lawfully considered hemp and you can sell them in various products. Those carved it out of the Controlled Substances Act and put them in outside of that act so they could be treated like any other ingredient that would go into a food or dietary supplement or cosmetic product.
Great. And one more question for you, Will, and then we'll jump over to Jen. Just to, again, to make sure we're all on the same page. Can you just talk about the Schedule 1 through Schedule 5 and what that means in your world?
Sure. So Schedule 1 through 5 is the regime that was created by the Controlled Substances Act. And the idea was we are aware there's various drugs of abuse potential, right? But they also have medicinal purposes. So from the Schedule 2 on down to 5, 5 being the least controlled, 2 being the most controlled when it comes to something with a medicinal use. What you see is basically trying to control the manufacture, the distribution, and the use of all these medicinal products that are useful, but have a risk that they may be abused for recreational purposes. So for example, cocaine is actually a Schedule 2 product because while it has a high potential for abuse, it actually also has a medicinal use as an anesthetic, which many people don't know about. And so therefore it's allowed to be utilized and distributed in medical facilities for its anesthetic purposes. Interesting, Schedule 1 is the highest of the schedule, and that is outside of any medical use. So this is substances that are believed to just be high abuse potential, but actually have no medical benefit. And unfortunately, marijuana falls in the Schedule 1 along with like LSD and other substances that aren't used as medicine. And the fight over whether or not marijuana should be in Schedule 1 has been intense, but that's how Schedule 1 sort of differs from the rest of the schedules, and that's where marijuana is right now.
Great. Thanks, Will. And that's a good lead-in, Jen, to the question I have for you, which is, you have this ongoing conflict between state and federal law where federally marijuana remains a Schedule I drug. The states have legalized it. But because it is illegal at the federal level, access to capital is very difficult, traditional capital by way of the banking system. You counsel clients that are in various phases of operations. Some of them are still fundraising and will be fundraising, just like any other startup would be. And I was curious as to what their experience has been when you've heard or learned from them about trying to capture capital.
Sure. Yeah. And it's been very interesting to see. Obviously, COVID has made a lot of things harder, and capital raising could be viewed as one of those. The interesting facet about the cannabis space, though, is that unlike a lot of other industries, cannabis has actually been, at least in Pennsylvania and some other jurisdictions that I work in, has actually increased over the course of 2020. A lot of in those states where medical marijuana was viewed as an essential business, their demand has continued to grow during this period. Their hiring needs and everything else have continued to ramp. So it's become even more urgent for a lot of companies to have access to capital, so as to expand their operations and to otherwise kind of move to the next level. So I see capital being deployed. I think people are investing. It's just taking a little bit longer. They're taking a harder look at balance sheets. They're taking a harder look at exit strategies, especially given the current dynamic where there's a lot of, there's a handful, maybe more than a handful of kind of really large, well-known players who are known as MSOs, multi-state operators, where they're in a number of jurisdictions and they're kind of building up these really robust businesses. And as a result, they have the cash flow and they have a balance sheet that's allowing them to really be aggressive and to enter into those markets that they feel are ready. And so there's kind of the push and pull between folks who are looking to kind of go it alone and continue to fundraise to get the capex in that they need to fulfill their business strategy, versus kind of the siren call of being acquired by a large established multi-state operator who can, provide definitely some benefits, but you're obviously giving up control. So I'm seeing a lot of that dynamic, that dichotomy and push and pull happening throughout 2020. And then you also have all of the kind of logistical complexities that COVID is putting into play, as far as not being able to have those kind of face-to-face interactions that are often important in bringing in money, and touring facilities and things of that nature are much harder these days.
Great, thanks. And that's maybe a good place to pivot over to Liz. I do want to talk to you, Liz, about what's going on the Hill, especially as it relates to banking. But can you give us just a general sense as to what is going on in DC in kind of the lobbyist world related to the cannabis industry?
Sure. Well, I think Will and I were talking the other day that the last thing we did before the shutdown was go to Pittsburgh and speak to this group in person. I think that was just about the last in-person thing any of us got to do. So since March, I would say the overall sense in DC has just been whiplash and exhaustion, and it's hard to tell from day to day what's happening. We've had 4 COVID relief bills now. The Democrats passed a 5th bill, the HEROES Act, back in May. Since then, we've had a number of smaller bills come out of the Senate. We hear different things by the hour in terms of negotiations between Speaker Pelosi, Treasury Secretary Mnuchin, We hear different things about what McConnell is willing to accept versus the president. So some days we wake up in the morning and we hear that we're getting a relief package, and then by lunchtime we're absolutely not getting a relief package, and then by close of business we really might be getting a relief package. So as somebody who, as I mentioned, I work in a number of healthcare spaces, it has been exhausting. And if you speak to members of Congress who aren't in leadership, even the members of Congress don't really know hour to hour sort of where things stand. And it is, of course, taken up all of the oxygen in every room. It's made it impossible to do much of anything else. So all of the hopes that we had for the legislative agenda for the rest of this year, even recognizing that as an election year, it was always going to be a weird year. All of that has sort of gone out the window. That being said, there are, the COVID relief bills that we have seen pass have had some good things in them for different players in healthcare, and the HEROES Act, and I think we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but the HEROES Act actually had some cannabis provisions, did not go anywhere past the House. But there have been attempts from a lot of different factions to connect different pieces of legislation, different priority pieces of legislation to those relief packages. You could ask me at the end of this conversation how things have changed from where they were at the start of this conversation. I'm sure there will be some sort of October surprise in the next hour.
Yet another October surprise. So any talk at all about relief on the banking front, which is I think the number one issue facing the industry?
Sure. So, back in February, last time we spoke, the banking piece seemed like it had the best chance of survival of both chambers of a split Congress, where you have a Republican president, Democratic controlled House, and Republican controlled Senate. We'll talk a little bit about how Colorado state laws really mobilized a lot of what we see today nationally. That is true of any bipartisanship that we see in Congress. And starting with Colorado, I think Colorado is a great example. You've got a Republican senator in Cory Gardner who, jumped on board of cannabis, and you have, as more states, more purple to red states have allowed for adult use and medical use of cannabis, more Republicans have come to the table. And what has brought them to the table is federalism, is this idea that states should be able to decide for themselves, and also the love of small businesses. So as more small businesses populate in these states, we have seen support congeal around the banking piece in particular, because nobody wants to see those small businesses have to do all of their transactions in cash. So we thought, even though every Congress we get dozens upon dozens of different cannabis bills, the Safe Banking Act seemed like the one that was going to go the distance this time around. And indeed, Safe Banking Act provisions were what was included in that House Democrat HEROES bill that did pass in May. It passed along party lines, but it did pass the House. It was, at least one starting point for negotiations. Senate Democrats have defended the inclusion of those Safe Banking Act provisions and have tried to include them in some of the slimmed down Senate relief bills that, again, have not passed, haven't been signed into law, but have been proposed. So there's still attempts being made, and the defenses that we hear when there have been criticisms of why are we doing anything with cannabis in a COVID relief bill, but these are small businesses and they are transacting in cash. And so Democrats have been, and the Republicans who defend this have been pretty stalwart in saying we should do something if we can in those relief bills.
Great. So I guess we will have to stay tuned and recognize that any relief package, I suspect, and you tell me if I'm wrong, there will be some relief package at some point in time. We'll have to make sure to stay on top of that to understand how it impacts the cannabis industry and maybe gives relief on the banking front.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Will, I'd like to turn back to you and talk a little bit more about the FDA. How specifically are they connected to the industry, to what's going on? Let's call it Main Street, Pennsylvania, where you've got your dispensary, you've got folks with these pop-up CBD stores, you've got the growers and the processors. Help us understand how the FDA is actually involved in overseeing those operations.
So FDA is largely out of overseeing issues related to state medical and recreational marijuana regulation. So they've made a decision and they've said basically if it abides by state law, we know it may violate federal law, may violate Controlled Substances Act, but we're not going to get involved, which is an interesting situation because you have people producing products that would normally be regulated by FDA. If you have sort of edibles or if you have food product or smokable product, those would all be regulated by FDA. And now those sort of shift to the state regulator in order to ensure that, outside of just making sure the amount of THC is in it, making sure that the product is manufactured in a food quality way for an edible, for example, or in a way that's okay to inhale, for example, for some sort of vaping product. And that's really put a lot of pressure on these state regulators to be able to handle sort of sophisticated manufacturing for cannabis products.
Got it. And Will, I'm gonna throw one at you here from left field. Whatever happened? There was, maybe it was earlier this year, the big push about the vaping concerns, and folks were getting very ill from it. Was that resolved, and how so?
I think the big resolution was you basically got more control over the supply chain for vaping. I mean, what you had was FDA cracked down on those people that were trying to make vaping as sort of a household combination. So what you saw was there was a number of issues with vaping products that were defective in some way. And then you also saw people who were sort of making homebrew various vaping products and that they were adulterated or they had safety problems. And FDA basically came into the space and said, hey, we need all this vaping stuff we regulate all tobacco products. And as a result, we're going to come in and try and shut down this industry and try and shut down bad ingredient suppliers, bad people who are making home brews, the smaller guys that are trying to make various vape stores that are making various combination things. And we're going to shut down the people who are providing vape pens that have fundamental problems. So that's cured a lot of that space. And because most of the people that rely on cannabis vaping rely upon the typical channel of the vaping products, well, if you clean up the normal product distribution method for electronic vaping, well, then you've also cured up a lot of the problems with cannabis vaping as well.
Great, thanks. Jen, I led into this by saying, when we did this in February, right, it was, things were a little bit uncertain in the industry. It was going through some financial difficulties. Around that time, the industry started to pivot to becoming more mature. And I was wondering if you could help us understand what that means and what you're seeing in kind of deal activity in just the last 7 or 8 months, even though COVID persists.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the story hasn't changed fundamentally from what we were looking at in the beginning of 2020. And it varies. I mean, unlike a lot of industries, since there's a good bit of variance in each state, depending on when the state came online, how they approached their specific program has resulted in different levels of maturation, if you will, for companies in different states. For example, in Pennsylvania, I think that the overall consensus is that its program has been received pretty favorably. And as a result, most folks think that the Pennsylvania market is doing well and is going to continue to grow. And as a result, there seems to be increased interest in Pennsylvania, both as far as access to capital, funds coming in, and others, but also on the consolidation front. I know when Pennsylvania's program was first born, if you will, there was a lot of emphasis on allowing small business owners to to have ownership. And since that time, it seems there has been a pivot where there has been a lot of consolidation, where larger players have come onto the scene and acquired companies. So I think that that's something we're seeing in some other jurisdictions, where some jurisdictions like Ohio and other places where they may be struggling a little bit more, they're at a kind of a more nascent point. So they're still looking more at getting the program off the ground and getting kind of that initial capital to get their build outs completed and get their plants in the ground, et cetera, et cetera. So it varies a bit, but I think Pennsylvania is further along than a lot of states on that front. And as a result, we're seeing more kind of next level M&A consolidation than some other states. I would also say that we're starting to see a continued evolution in kind of management and personnel, and it was fascinating to see the convergence of people who have historically been in the cannabis industry come together with folks who have been traditional, business investors and, in other industries coming together and trying to figure out how to work together in a way that makes sense. And so we're now seeing, as companies mature and evolve, kind of a shift in some of that personnel and the management into kind of the more, I don't want to say professional realm, but kind of professional realm. So, and that also makes sense given the increased visibility that we've seen on the public side of the equation with the companies that have gone public, especially coming through Canada, given their legalization in Canada in the end of 2018, which kind of was the zenith of the bubble that has kind of deflated, if not popped a bit since then. But those are all factors that we're continuing to see evolve in 2020. That being said, I took a look, and as far as capital raises to date, looking at Viridian Capital Advisors, which is one of the well-known advisors in the cannabis space, through September, they noted that private company deal flow, both on the equity and debt side in 2020, they cited a total of 39 raises versus 2019, where there were 137. So clearly a big difference between 2019 and 2020. And I think that's a combination of the deflation of the bubble. People are starting to get a little bit more in line on kind of some crazy valuations that were out there, but also the impact of COVID, I think, in the economy generally is definitely having an impact as well.
Jenny, here, I'll throw a curveball at you here. So let's assume the cannabis industry fully matures, right? It becomes a household industry. Who end up being the biggest fish? Is it existing companies? And for instance, I've always thought big tobacco is going to get into it, but I was just curious, who is the biggest fish that's going to survive when this is all said and done?
Yeah, and there's a lot of speculation. I mean, there was all kinds of hype coming out of the ramp up to Canada going rec legal that you were going to get, the beverage industry, the food industry, that a lot of kind of established big business was going to jump in head first. Coca-Cola was going to, become a player and everything else. And that hasn't really matured the way that folks were speculating. That being said, there are some large food product companies, multinationals that are definitely in the space, maybe behind the scenes to some extent. So I think that as eyes pivot toward the feds and going, descheduling, I think that everyone's trying to kind of jockey and position themselves to take advantage of that when it happens. So I think it's going to be a combination of your traditional large players in the food, beverage, maybe tobacco space, along with those companies that have already managed to position themselves as large multi-state operators or have gone public already, and are kind of leveraging their access to capital to continue to acquire, so as to be well positioned in a lot of jurisdictions if and when it goes kind of federally legal.
Great, you hit the curveball. Liz, the prognosticator of prognosticators. I asked you to predict who was going to win the president in February. You got the nominees right. Are you willing to predict today who's going to take it home?
So I was thinking about, if you ask this, how to skirt this question. I won't make a prediction, but I will tell you who is making a prediction. And that is the Republican Party is predicting that the Democrats will win both the Senate and the presidency. I say that both based on conversations I have with Republican Senate staffers frequently, who's, I won't name any names, but I've heard multiple times now on different issues. Can't you just wait till next year when we're in the minority and you can pass the thing you want to pass? And based on, I think, where the president is spending money and not spending money, I believe he just pulled all his money out of Florida TV. I think that he's trying to level set, set the bar low. So I'm not going to make any predictions, but there are people who will. I will not say anything about the presidency, but the Senate, I think it's really is looking good for Democrats. It was looking good just based on the math. 2018 was a tough year. Of course, Dems lost a few seats, went from being one seat in the minority to 3 seats. And just by virtue of how many seats are up, Dems are only have 12 seats up in the Senate this year. And Republicans have 20 some. I should know the exact number, but it just the math, the way it plays out, that their 6-year terms was going to be favorable to Dems going into this. So I think that, you could see Trump finding his way to 270 electoral votes. He did it before. The math is there for him to do it again. I think the Senate is looking stronger than the presidency for Dems. And so that will change the calculation. Everybody's kind of taking the House for granted. I don't think it's a good idea to take it for granted. That said, I think it's pretty safe to stay with the Dems. Had enormous pickups in 2018, and Dems are going to lose some of those, but Dems are also going to pick up some other seats. In particular, there's some high-profile retirements that are coming up. Susan Brooks out of Indiana. Her seat is likely to go to a Democrat. Will Hurd is maybe the best known, really bipartisan Republican. He's out of Texas. He's retiring. That seat likely to flip to Democrats. So there's a few of those where just, the retirements mean that Dems are likely to pick some up. And Democrats, I think, are also making other seats that were not in really contests before are trying to make those seats. So I think that we're going to lose some, we're going to see them lose some seats that they picked up. We're going to see some of those freshmen are going to be one-term freshmen, but then we're going to see some fresh faces as well.
So rather than ask you various scenarios, let's assume Trump wins and the Senate flips. Let's assume Biden wins, the Senate stays the same, House. What is the makeup of politically of the presidency, the House, and the Senate that is kind of the perfect combination to really elevate the cannabis industry, to pass the bills that have been sitting on desks, and to make this to help it mature even further?
I simply put, Democrats are more friendly to cannabis. The biggest thing that anybody could do, we've talked a little bit about the banking piece. Will has talked a little bit about how you've got CBD versus cannabis. You've got different definitions, what's hemp derived, all of that has been legislated and regulated and parsed over the past few years. There's a bill right now, the MORE Act, and that would just fully deschedule cannabis. It would take it right out of the Controlled Substances Act. And so all these little pieces that we talk about banking and the tax code, that wouldn't be an issue anymore. That bill almost came up to a vote about a month ago. It didn't quite make it to the House floor for a vote. But interestingly, it is the lead sponsor on it is Jerry Nadler out of New York, not a guy who's been, really in front of the cannabis issues, but he's the lead sponsor. It has 117 Democratic co-sponsors. It's got one Republican, Matt Gaetz out of Florida. Matt Gaetz, he's one of those Republicans who saw the way his state was turning and decided to get on board, get behind businesses in Florida, small businesses, cannabis businesses. So he's one of those Republicans who will vote to further cannabis, whether it be medical, adult use, any of those issues. So yeah, briefly, the Dems are friendlier, especially to large efforts like just wholly descheduling it. That all said, we have whatever happens on Tuesday, we've got a lame duck coming up, right? Where things, we don't know what's going to happen, but if, say, Dems do win back the Senate and or the presidency, expect nothing to happen around cannabis in the lame duck, because they're just going to wait till they can do the MORE Act or more in the next Congress. So that's sort of a weird thing where if Dems win, it will be good ultimately, I think, for the cannabis industry, but it means Dems are going to wait. If say Dems lost the House and still lost the Senate and the presidency, if Republicans came back and swept everything, I think Democrats would push to include something like SAFE or other provisions in the lame duck.
Got it. Will, taking what Liz just said, that if the Democrats win everything, sweep everything, again, we're being apolitical here, but just trying to project what this means for business in the industry. And it is the THC is descheduled. What can you tell us what that means? Marijuana is descheduled. What does that mean? How does it impact enforcement?
If it does become descheduled? Is that the
Correct.
question? Yes. So yeah, you really, I mean, some people have been trying to push marijuana to be rescheduled so that it would be like a Schedule 2 or 3 or 4. That really wouldn't change much because it would still, everything would still be a controlled substance. People have argued, hey, marijuana is a medicinal product. Look at all this stuff. It should really not be a 1. It should be a 2 or 3 or 4. That could help with theoretically pharmaceutical research and that helping doctors to get more of it and to do their own clinical trials. But it really wouldn't help the regular person or the industry, the recreational industry on the state level, or even the medical marijuana level, medical marijuana industry on the state level, because again, it would still be a controlled substance. But if you took it all out of the controlled substance and took it away from federal oversight, that would be the thing that basically, I think, really would incentivize a lot of growth in the space, because then you don't have this issue with the Banking Act. You don't have these issues of enforcement. You basically try and take it away from federal oversight, including probably the FDA. Now, various consumer products that are sold across state lines, those may still be regulated by FDA. So your consumer products that have CBD in foods or dietary supplements, that would need its own legislation to basically cure that, or FDA pass its own regulations about what it considers to be a safe level of CBD as an ingredient in food or dietary supplements. But removing it out of the schedule entirely, marijuana, if you removed it out of the controlled substance schedule entirely, I think you'd see a lot more investment in the state side on the recreational and medical side.
Will, is alcohol scheduled at all?
No. So alcohol and tobacco, are the classic sort of sin products that are not in the Controlled Substances Act and are seen as the products that can be recreationally used as drugs. And so those have their own regulatory structure. FDA does regulate tobacco, and the TTB regulates alcohol, but it is completely outside the scope of the Controlled Substances Act, as well as a lot of other restrictions that normally you would have for drug products.
Setting aside kind of the food-related issues, if it was descheduled, do you see the feds just kind of washing their hands of cannabis and saying in states you regulate it as you see fit?
Yeah, I mean, I would have to assume that when they deschedule it, what the argument would be, we're going to completely remove it from the Controlled Substances Act, and we're basically going to kick this off to a state level and say, states, do what you want to do. If you want to have it, grown and processed in your state and used and have a market for it, fine. If you don't, that's fine. We will regulate interstate commerce and movement of these things. And maybe if states want to band together and all have some sort of regulatory regime so it can move from California to Colorado, maybe we'll let that go. But in general, what we will do is only regulate things that move across state lines, and otherwise the states, you create the regime that you want, and we will just sit back and just watch what you do. I think that's probably the most bullish chance. There's other theories where you could basically create a structure like they have for tobacco, where FDA regulates it and it's really regulated at the federal level. I don't know if there's much enthusiasm for that at this point. I think the more likely outcome, especially to get Republicans on board, is arguing that this is a federalism issue and just shove it down to the states.
Got it. Great. So again, Jen, let's stick with the bullish approach here. Folks are perhaps sensing that the floodgates are going to open and they want to invest. You work with companies in the space that are courting investors. What sort of questions do investors ask? What sort of diligence should they be doing as they analyze an opportunity in the cannabis space?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, 90% of what we see investors looking at is what they would look at in any kind of startup investment in a space that's pretty kind of CapEx intensive, especially for grower processors. But they're looking at, who's your team, making sure that the management is sound and, good to go for the next evolution of the company. They're looking at your valuations, they're looking at your projections, and they're looking a little bit closer, I'd say, than perhaps in some other cases at your tax strategy and in your financials, with a kind of lens through dealing with 280E of the federal tax code, and how that obviously has a large impact on a medical marijuana company's bottom line. But otherwise, I think they're asking all of the same questions that they would ask in most spaces in the startup world. So I don't see a huge amount of difference there. It's very important for them, obviously, to make sure they understand the additional risk profile, given the dichotomy currently between federal and state laws relating to the space.
Great. Thanks. We do have a question that popped up, which I think is actually a good one, and maybe I'll take a crack at answering it. And then after I answer this, I'd like to ask the panel, if you had money to invest, millions of dollars, if you had Jen Minter money, where would you invest it in the space? So let's take a look at this question here, which is basically, in Pennsylvania, would the Commonwealth use its existing state store distribution infrastructure as marijuana delivery or use, I should say, is expands in Pennsylvania? So what I understand is, and this would be in connection with adult use / recreational. There's already an existing dispensary regime in place for the medical marijuana system here in PA. What I understand the governor's position to be is, I don't really care how it gets to people. It just needs to be legalized at a recreational perspective. When he says, I don't care how it gets to people, don't sell it on street corners, obviously. But if you, the Republican legislature, would like to use some sort of controlled process by which it is sold, I'll entertain that. But it's my understanding thus far, and the state store system may be one of those vehicles. But I just don't think there's much conversation between the governor and the legislature about what that actually means. The Republicans in the Commonwealth have kind of taken the theme. It's a good idea. We kind of like the sound of it, but now's not the right time. We should be, and it's kind of a revenue approach. Instead of focusing so much on legalizing adult use cannabis in Pennsylvania to generate taxes, why don't we instead use that energy to support business growth, existing traditional business growth in Pennsylvania, and harvest more taxes that way? So it's kind of this, it's politics is really what it is. So good question. Appreciate you asking it. And we'll, I think, find out in the next 3 to 6 months where this is going to go in PA.
Yeah, and Jason, on that point, I do think it'll be very interesting to see if it passes in New Jersey, given its proximity to Pennsylvania, and folks start to see the revenue generation, especially on that. I think that folks may start to sing from a different songbook to some degree, but you're right. We're gonna have to wait and see how that evolves.
Yeah, it has followed kind of the same trajectory as gaming. As all the neighboring states legalize it, all of a sudden it's the moral concerns around it are
It
outweighed
becomes more
by the
palatable.
revenue.
Absolutely. Yep.
So to your point, the more we're surrounded by where folks can drive across the border and buy it, presumably, more likely it is to be legalized here. We have another question that came in here, and Jen, maybe this will be a good one for you. Do we see any mom and pop grow operations opening similar to micro breweries? Maybe you could talk about that in the context of the existing regulations.
Yeah. So as far as kind of mom and pop grow operations, at least within Pennsylvania, I think the answer is no for now, largely because the regulatory regime that Pennsylvania has in place, and that I think a lot of other jurisdictions have in place, is so robust as far as what you need to do to stay in the good graces of the Department of Health, from a security perspective, from a transport perspective, from an inventory control perspective. It would be very hard from a pure cost perspective for really small operations to get off the ground. I do think that various grow and processing operations in Pennsylvania do kind of posit themselves differently as far as their overall approach is concerned. There are some that very much view themselves as craft growers, for lack of a better term, where they kind of view themselves as either, like I've heard the claim, the Whole Foods of medical marijuana, where they charge a higher price and they feel like they have a higher quality product because of the level of terpenes and kind of other formulas in their products. And there are others who kind of consider themselves more the Coors Light, as far as mass production is concerned. So I think there's some variation on that front, but I don't see, at least in Pennsylvania and a couple of the other jurisdictions that I know the regulatory structure, and I don't see any really small operators kind of being able to readily come online.
I'll jump in on that as well. And I'm gonna loop this to your earlier question, which I know somebody else has asked us to return to, which is where do you see investment? I do think if we see the MORE Act passed, the MORE Act actually stands for Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment and Expungement Act. If you see Democrats take over the Senate and the White House, I think we're going to see wholesale descheduling at some point, and any cannabis efforts are going to be tied to criminal justice reform and to overhauling access to banking. There's been a lot of focus within the industry on how we still see communities of color penalized, jailed for cannabis-related nonviolent crimes, still being arrested for them. At the same time, it's an incredibly white industry. And I think that there is an effort to change that. There's definitely an effort within the Democratic Party to address some of those inequities as they sort of help to build this industry nationally. And I think interestingly, so the House has really been driving the MORE Act with Jerry Nadler, as I mentioned, at the helm. There is an identical, sorry, dogs are, getting antsy. There is an identical Senate bill, and it is led by none other than the potentially future Vice President Harris. So definitely something that I think she cares about, and we could see mom and pops as access to banking and more equitable opportunities arise.
Great, thanks, Liz. Okay, Jen, we're gonna go around the horn here. I guess maybe I'll start. If I had $5 million, where would I put it? I personally would probably find the strongest MSO and put my money there. I think it's probably the least risky investment. I'm risk averse. Least risky in the cannabis space, I should say, which, and I would hope that they are acquired by a household brand once it is descheduled.
Okay, well, you totally stole my answer, Jason. No, similarly, I mean, I think I would.
You get a twofer.
I would do some diligence, and I would try to find a really strong MSO, maybe not one of the biggest, but one of the strongest as far as looking at their balance sheet, looking at what jurisdictions they're in and what they've been able to do with the programs within which they've been working, and what their potential exit strategies are. And I'd probably sink my money into a couple of those.
Liz?
So I would take a strong look at the states that have it on the ballot, especially Arizona. I think 3 of those states, Arizona, Mississippi, and Montana, have competitive Senate races. And I think those Senate races are going to help the ballot measures to pass. Arizona, I think, is particularly interesting and should ripe for investment. And because you also just heard my dog wanting me to get off the Zoom, I think veterinary CBD is really, really interesting. And everybody I know uses it if they have a stressed out dog. I know Will has, I'm throwing him under the bus here a little bit. I know Will has done some work in the veterinary space. So I don't know if he has feelings on how that needs to be regulated, but it is out there.
Interesting. I like that. All right, Will.
Sure. So if I was investing, I'd do, I'd try and diversify, because I don't know exactly who's going to be a winner. So I definitely would think that, there's interesting things in the pharmaceutical space, like GW Labs. There's a lot of other people investing in the cannabinoid space. I think there's going to be some major home runs that we're going to find using cannabinoids as an active pharmaceutical ingredient. In general, I like the play of people who are basically bundling up the licenses and going in every state and getting licenses, not just in one state, but they have a whole cadre of states that they have licenses to either grow or distribute or produce. Because I do think that you're going to see, we've already seen these licenses are big fights. And if you can get them, I'm not sure how much those will open up to other people. You may have essentially sort of not a monopoly, but a duopoly or oligopoly for a while on those licenses within those states. And once they're sort of entrenched, they're going to be hard to get out. So the people that are sort of grabbing up licenses, I think, are an interesting deal. When it comes to recreational, I would look to the brands that are becoming very big. I presume that they will sort of spread. Even though you just sell sort of in Colorado, you can also have a brand go across. We had a company that had a THC beer, which I thought was very interesting. I would look to what the market looks like in Canada as a very sort of vibrant, legalized recreational market, and see the brands that are growing there. I got a feeling that whoever becomes big will sort of win overall. And then on the food side with the CBDs and the cosmetics, that's really hard to handicap because there's so many entrants and so many players. There's probably going to be a couple that win. I'd probably invest in what's the biggest ones now if I was told to invest in that space, but that space is the hardest to handicap because there is no real restrictions into getting into that space. And there's a lot of people that are just jumping in, and it's a market that we're seeing a lot of, maybe even too many people come in for great returns. So there's going to be probably a bloodbath at some point where a bunch of these people are going to get wiped out.
Great. And it's 3:27. We have one more question, and I think after we answer this, we ought to call it a day. But maybe, Will, this is for you because you are the most science-minded of us. The impact on health that some studies are finding, negative impacts on health that some studies are finding associated with marijuana use. How does this play out?
So I definitely think we're going to find out more and more adverse effects of intense use of cannabis and intense use of cannabis for a long duration. We already know, for example, that cannabis use and THC use has been shown to tip people into schizophrenia as one of the major concerns that's not really talked about as much. Obviously, smoking things is not great for your lungs. And there's some concern there. My understanding is it's near as carcinogenic as cigarettes. But again, smoking things is not usually a good way to have the health of your lungs. And most of the stuff in cannabis is moving away from, I think, hard smokables into a vaping that's a little bit cleaner, or maybe sublingual or edibles or other ways to get into your system. But the idea that there's going to be this rash of adverse effects associated with long-term chronic use of marijuana, I think is probably true. And one of the interesting things is down in Florida, one of the major people who supported I believe medical marijuana was somebody who was a plaintiff tort attorney, and people secretly thought, hey, the reason he's supporting this is because the next major wave of major tort action is going to be in the cannabis space. And I do think that at some point there's going to be torts related to long-term use about cannabis, and we'll probably see warnings on cannabis similarly to what we have on cigarettes or what we have on alcohol, just as a matter of settlement. I don't think it's going to derail. I don't think that's going to derail the drive to legalize recreational or medical. I just think it's probably going to end up where we are with alcohol and cigarettes, where it's, yeah, you had some litigation and now you have warnings, and it's highly regulated.
Great. Okay. Well, it is 3:30. Thanks to my panelists. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that Buchanan, Ingersoll & Rooney is one of the top-rated cannabis firms in the United States by a legitimate ranking service called Chambers. You can look it up. It is kind of the blue ribbon of law firm ranking services, and the group that I'm with today are the backbone of our success. So thanks, Jen, Liz, and Will, for joining me today. I hope everyone took something away from it. I was asked to make a couple of housekeeping announcements. Here are the next programs coming up at the Three Rivers Venture Fair. At 5 o'clock, happy hour begins. Everyone is welcome to attend. Tomorrow, the fair will continue with our University Technology Showcase at 10:30 a.m. Come see what our brightest young entrepreneurs in the region have in the works. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. We really appreciate your time, and best of luck in the cannabis space.